Okay, so we all know the type, right? You're sitting in a coffee shop, or maybe you're just scrolling through a family group chat, and there they are, the person who has literally solved the entire national economy before their morning coffee even cools down. They point fingers at these big, abstract nouns, and they offer these unbelievably simple, magical solutions to what are honestly incredibly complex systemic issues. Well, welcome to today's Explainer. Today we're diving into a really fascinating masterclass of an essay by P.L.Gaya titled Alguns inconsequentiais na esquina, which translates to some inconsequentials on the corner. Guy just brilliantly takes apart this casual, overconfident economic bar talk. So grab a seat, let's step into the classroom and see exactly how he deconstructs the corner talker's illusion.
Here's our syllabus for today's lecture. We're going to cover the corner talker's illusion, the magic of aggregate demand, dissecting the inflation monster, capital is solid not liquid, dependency and mimetic desires, and finally, the ultimate question, and then.
All right, diving right into Module 1, the corner talker's illusion. So to really get this, we need to understand one absolutely crucial word, reification. According to Gaya's essay, this is basically the corner talker's absolute favorite magic trick. It's what happens when bad public economics takes abstract nouns and pretends they're actual characters in a play. You hear it all the time, right? The market punishes, or demand suffers, or inflation arrives. By doing this, the real human agents, the actual people who received the money first, who paid later, who saved, who took the risks, they completely disappear from the story. Reification just magically erases human choice. And as the essay points out, the corner talker uses this exact kind of language as a shield. It's a shield to protect their own intellectual laziness. They toss around these heavy buzzwords like aggregate demand or the market, as if just naming a ghost is the exact same thing as actually explaining how a mechanism works. Gaya's entire goal here is to take all that noisy confidence and put it right under a microscope.
Which brings us to Module 2, the magic of aggregate demand.
Notice the stark contrast we have here. In serious economic science, aggregate demand is a really useful category for studying cycles and monetary policy. But Gaya argues that when it becomes a vulgar doctrine, like the bar talk version, it just morphs into pure magical thinking. In this fantasy version, if the state just spends more money, the economy spends and growth is infinite. The essay points out that this basically acts as a moral license for reckless spending. Why? Because the word aggregate so conveniently erases all the tough questions. It stops us from asking, well, who actually pays for this? What is actually being produced? And which specific sector gets the stimulus?
And this brings us to what I think is a fantastic visual metaphor from the essay. People so often think that a little bit of inflation is like a cozy fire warming up a cold house. But as Gaya points out, new money is not heat. It doesn't bake bread, it doesn't pave roads, and it definitely doesn't invent semiconductors. Money is simply a command over wealth. Printing more of those commands without actually increasing the real wealth being commanded doesn't magically create prosperity. It just creates a really bitter dispute over the real goods that already exist.
Moving on to Module 3, dissecting the inflation monster.
Okay, I really want you to picture this. The corner talker imagines monetary expansion as this gentle, refreshing rain falling evenly over a vast plain, making everyone's crops grow at exactly the same time. Sounds nice, right? But the essay argues it is actually more like a tap overflowing from the apartment upstairs. The people who get the money first, the folks on the top floors, they get to buy goods at the old, cheaper prices. But by the time that money finally trickles down to the people living on the bottom floor, the prices on the shelves have already gone up. The latecomers just lose their purchasing power. It is a chronological transfer of wealth, not some sudden burst of collective prosperity.
So let's look at how this builds into the famous spiral. We've all heard the excuses, oh, the exchange rate caused the inflation, or no, workers demanding higher wages caused it. Just look at this step-by-step chain reaction. The author describes this spiral as a society desperately trying not to be the last one fooled. Everyone is just trying to survive the other person's price hike. But here is the secret Gaya reveals. A spiral needs fuel. And he argues that the actual fuel, the real incubator of the entire problem, is always that initial monetary expansion and a lack of fiscal credibility. Which leads us to a wonderfully Socratic question posed in the essay. Greed inflation. It's a very popular corner talk theory right now. It basically claims prices go up simply because business owners are greedy. But really think about it for a second. Did business owners just discover greed this year? Like, did they all take a collective moral vacation during the years when inflation was low? Gaya argues that blaming a permanent economic phenomenon on a sudden onset of moral failure is just lazy psychology. It's not serious analysis. Businesses always want profit. The real economic question is, what conditions suddenly allow them to raise prices so broadly across the board?
Okay, Module 4. Capital is solid, not liquid.
Here we return to that trick of reification we talked about earlier. The corner talker loves to paint the market as this angry, shadowy villain that wakes up greedy and just decides to punish democracies. But the essay reminds us, the market isn't a person. It is a process. It is a vast, complex network of millions of individual plans, expectations, and dispersed information. And guess what? You and I, we're part of that market. Treating it as a villain, the essay argues, is just a remarkably convenient way to totally absolve bad government policies from any real responsibility.
This brings us to a deeply analytical concept: capital heterogeneity. Now, central planners often look at capital as just this homogeneous blob, right? Just the letter K on a spreadsheet that they can move around effortlessly. But out in the real world, capital has bones. It has a very specific purpose. A shoe factory doesn't just magically transform into an MRI manufacturing plant because a politician signs a fancy decree. An idle factory isn't always just waiting around for magical demand. Sometimes it's literally just the tombstone of a previous bad investment.
As the essay so powerfully states, capital is not water. You cannot pour it seamlessly from one sector of the economy into another without massive costs, a huge loss of time, and sheer waste. Capital is solid, and when it gets manipulated artificially by false signals or bad policy, solids break. This is exactly why the arrogance of central planning can be so profoundly destructive to actual, real-world wealth creation.
Module 5. Dependency and mimetic desires.
The essay defines this specific trap beautifully. Developing nations often suffer from an excess of fantasy about themselves. They look at rich countries and they want the fruits, but they don't want to plant the roots. They want Scandinavian welfare, American consumption, and Swiss currency, but they completely ignore the incredibly difficult roots required to actually grow those things: high productivity, robust savings, capital accumulation, and strong, stable institutions. They act like the automobile is born from a political decree rather than from a long, hard chain of technical tradition and discipline.
And when that magical political decree inevitably fails, what happens? They blame imperialism. The vulgar version of dependency theory is just incredibly comfortable. As Gaya writes, it transforms domestic institutional failure into this heroic biography. It creates a neat little moral narrative that completely absolves their own domestic political failures and bureaucratic piracy.
Finally, we arrive at Module 6, the ultimate question. And then? And then what? This right here is the fatal question. According to Gaya, it is the one question that utterly destroys the corner talker's entire worldview. Bad economics only ever looks at the immediate first step, right? The flashy spending, the freshly printed money, the shiny new price control. Serious economics, on the other hand, demands that we look at the trajectory after that first step. The essay maps out these inevitable second and third order effects so clearly. After the public spending comes the financing. After the artificial credit comes the really messy allocation of resources. After the printing of money comes the cruel redistribution of purchasing power. As Gaya so brilliantly summarizes it, the economy is a highly complex living organism, and arithmetic, unlike political militancy, is completely unimpressed by good intentions. And that, naturally, brings us to interest rates, which corner talkers almost always treat as some sort of moral evil. But interest rates aren't a punishment. They are simply a reflection of the cruel reality of time. They ask the tough, adult questions. How much is the present worth compared to the future? What is the actual cost of waiting? What is the real cost of trusting a country's future when they have a track record of constantly changing the rules? So, as we wrap up today's explainer, I want to leave you with this final, truly provocative thought. The next time you hear someone at a cafe casually solving the national economy with buzzwords and blaming abstract villains, I want you to apply Pedro Gaya's framework. Ask yourself, and maybe even ask them, and then what? Are we building our future on actual, hard-fought productivity, or are we just borrowing a fantasy that we literally cannot afford to pay back? Keep that question right there in your mental toolkit, and I promise you, you'll never fall for the corner talker's illusion again. Thanks so much for joining me for this lecture, and keep learning.